Hi, I'm Rachel and I'm here to do the concluding paragraphs tag. Or at least I think it's the concluding paragraphs tag because several weeks ago now Steve Donahue tagged me in something, but I haven't really been able to find the tag anywhere. And I believe it was started by the guys at Stripped Cover Lit, or maybe he did a play on their opening paragraphs tag. But either way, I'll just link their two channels down below. So the concluding paragraphs tag is about showcasing some of your favorite ending lines of books. And I decided for my rendition, I would focus on a particular short story collection. This is The Best Place on Earth by Ayelet Sabari. It won the Sammy Rohr Prize for Fiction a few years ago, and other prizes as well. She's kind of in the vein of a Jhumpa Lahiri because, well, she's writing about a non-white ethnic experience. She's a Yemeni Israeli Jew, and also she's writing about clashes and juxtapositions between culture and identity and that sort of thing. But mostly it's I think it's what really strikes me like as a Lahiri thing is that her short stories are so rich and dense, and so they feel like there's a world inside of them. So I'll hoping she'll continue to write in this vein. Her latest project, which came out earlier this month, was actually a memoir, which was also really good, but I think I'll prefer her fiction. But anyway, my goal with this video is to talk about short stories, and particularly contemporary short stories, because I think they get a little bit of a shaft. There's this narrative about how they're open-ended. And I feel like in the case with these stories, it's a question of perspective and what you're trying to get out of them, because I think these stories always end on a note of emotional resonance. So maybe it doesn't make like physical sense, but that there's emotional resonance about how people view and perceive their own lives that really comes through in these stories. So I thought I'd highlight a few and talk about them, and yep, seems to be the point of a tag. So the first story I want to talk about in here is called Invisible. It's my favorite story of the bunch, and I actually reread this collection with my book club back in January. It was a reread for me anyway, and I think Invisible stuck out to a lot of us. It is the story of a Filipina caretaker in Israel who's looking after an elderly Yemeni Israeli Jew. This is a somewhat common occurrence in Israel, but Sabari gets in under the skin of it, and particularly the fact that this woman, Rosalind, is an undocumented immigrant. She overstayed her visa in order to keep making money for her family back in Manila. And this is juxtaposed against the experience of Savta, which is the woman she's looking after. Savta is just the Hebrew word for grandmother. And Savta grew up in Yemen, and she was an orphan, and in Yemen the Muslim authorities had a practice of converting Jewish orphans to Islam, and Savta didn't want to be taken away from her community like that, so she has this whole story, this whole narrative that she was able to disappear and evade the authorities before she was married and went off to Israel. And then at the end of this story, Rosalind comes into contact with immigration forces, basically, who are looking for illegal immigrants, and this is how the story ends. At her feet, Savta's ring glinted. Clarity washed over Rosalind like a bucket of cold water. She closed her eyes and willed herself to disappear. She heard the officer shifting, her army boots crunching pebbles, a voice urgently speaking onto the walkie-talkie, and felt her body shut down, become small and quiet and limp, her breath soft and light, her clothes a vacant, bodiless heap on the dusty floor. On the street, a car alarm went off, a loud, piercing whine, but Rosalind couldn't hear it. She was no longer there. And something my book club really got caught up in is whether or not this physically happened. And for me, it never crossed my mind to even be worried about that, because I felt like this was about emotional resonance, and that Rosalind like mentally needed to disappear and to follow Savta's story and to link it back to that character. So she, imagined it, and that was her truth in the moment, and it was about what she needed to keep it on with her life. The next story I want to talk about is called Below Sea Level, and it's defined by its protagonist, David, who feels inferior to his father, who's this kind of macho man and, you know, all that sort of stuff. But then when his father gets sick, the tables turn, and David hears about the sickness during a really rare visit to visit his father, and his father lives near the Dead Sea. And so because he lives near the Dead Sea and the father and son are hiking around it, Sabari is able to use that geographical reference to highlight what David is feeling now at the end of the story. The water engulfed him, smooth and silky, like warm honey. He felt a sting where his sandals had cut him on the walk. He advanced deeper until his feet were pushed up to the surface of the salty water, forcing him to lie horizontal. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't put them down. It occurred to him that he couldn't drown in this water. He took a long inhalation of rich air, interlaced his hands behind his head, and floated, weightless, buoyant. So yeah, this is about the fact that he's invincible in this moment, and that he can't fail at what he's doing, and he feels this confidence that for the first time he's not inferior or beneath someone, but that he's able to be buoyant in his life and on the sea. And then borders is defined by political content. The protagonist, Naamah, lived in the Sinai before Israel gave it to Egypt. She was a child and not political herself, and the situation in Sinai was a bit different than other settlements in Israel, and she actually lived much more in harmony with Arab neighbors, and in fact her life was especially defined by a Bedouin caretaker who, throughout the story, you get to learn more about him. The story actually takes place several years later when she returns to a lot near the Sinai, and she's sort of grousing over her life and what all of this means. Being forced to move, obviously, especially given the political overtones, means that she is accepting borders and boundaries. But then when she comes back as a young adult, there's a freedom of movement because the end of the story actually takes her into Egypt. Because now, you know, she's allowed to enter because of the peace treaty. And here's what Sabari writes. The Egyptian clerk eyed her as he stamped her passport with a 2-week visa, and she smiled and thanked him in Arabic. She gazed over her shoulder at the familiar skyline of Eilat, the hotels ablaze in the morning sun, an orange flame caught in each window. She looked past the Egyptian terminal to where Bedouin taxi drivers leaned against their dusty station wagons, waiting to take her to wherever she wanted to go. So for a story that is defined in the beginning by being forced out of places and having barriers thrown against you, then suddenly there's this freedom that she finds at the end. And freedom personified by choice and movement and lack of barriers. And finally, I'm going to talk about one of Sabari's Canadian stories. These stories are somewhat autobiographical, or at least follow some of the cadences of her life, and now she lives part-time at least in Canada. And so this story that she wrote is about immigrants in Canada, and it's called Brit Milah. The protagonist, Ryuma, visits her daughter Ofra in Toronto. Ofra is a new mother, and she has refused to circumcise her son. Ryuma takes this as an affront. She's an observant Yemeni Israeli woman, and here's her daughter who lives so far away from home, and she's married to a non-Jewish man and is just further and further moving away from her traditions and taking her grandson away from all of their shared roots. And so obviously there's an interpersonal conflict which makes up a big bulk of the story, and the question arises of whether or not people can get over conflict or if it tears them asunder. So Sabari uses her final paragraph to answer the question of whether mother and daughter can find common ground again. Yonatan let go of his mother's nipple, hanging off of her arm while Ofra wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She had hardly touched her soup. Here, Ryuma stood up and stretched her arms out to her daughter. You eat. Ofra looked up and her face brightened. She handed her Yonatan over the table. Hello, my soul. Ryuma looked at Yonatan's face and saw her husband, the dimple in his chin, the wide nose, the dark complexion. You look just like your granddad, she said, her eyes watering. Yonatan flapped his arms. Who's Grandma's little angel? She whispered. She placed him on her shoulder, the weight of his little body against her, familiar and comforting. So yeah, I felt like this was a subtle way to say that even though all of the arguments they were having before weren't solved, that they were finding some common ground again, this familiar and comforting presence between them. and this compromise of letting the poor mother eat and the grandmother at least could, take care of the grandson, who after all, despite any cultural changes, does look like the family. So that about covers it for me now. Below I'm also going to link a recent Washington Post article where they actually did a whole thing about their favorite lines in books, and I thought, oh, this is rather convenient, shared topic and all, so I figure I'll share it with you. I'll also leave links to my reviews of both of Sabari's works, the short stories and the memoir, in case you want to learn more about my thoughts and about these works. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.